Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis. Welcome back to our layman's study of the book of Joshua. Today we're looking at Joshua's reaction to his army's defeat at the hands of Ai, because God was angry that just one Israelite had stolen loot from Jericho after Israel's victory. Loot that was reserved by order of Joshua for God and God alone. Israel had just been defeated, so Joshua tears his clothes and falls to the earth on his face in front of the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, until evening. The text says the elders of Israel did the same, but most believe this only applied to their falling on their faces. We do know that they all put dust on their heads. Now, tearing one's clothes was an outward expression of extreme sorrow. You may remember it from Genesis chapter 37-34, when Jacob tore his clothes, learning of the supposed death of his beloved son Joseph. And it comes up again later in Genesis chapter 44, verse 13, when Joseph's brothers tore their clothes when it was discovered that Joseph's silver cup was found in the sack of their youngest brother, Benjamin. Throwing dirt on one's head was also an expression of extreme sorrow. It shows up later in Lamentations chapter 2, verse 10, and Ezekiel 27:30 in a more general sense and or prophetic sense. But the practice was common, and Joshua used both of these expressions in his sorrow. So Joshua was definitely mourning, not only the loss of his men, but also the loss of God's guidance and blessing. Matthew Henry suggested that neither Joshua nor the elders at this point knew or understood exactly why God had not given them this victory. And he contends that they were not only mourners, but also penitents, feeling that it was some sin among them, perhaps a sin that may have involved them, that brought God's disfavor about. Now Joshua addresses the Lord in earnest prayer and asks, "Why on earth did you bring us over the Jordan only to have us destroyed by our enemies? Why weren't we happy with just staying on the other side of the Jordan?" He was probably alluding to the two tribes that had decided to do just that. Then out of despair, in verse 8, he adds, "What can I say, Lord, now that Israel has run from our enemies, or as the NET says, retreated?" Here Joshua is pleading for the danger that Israel is now in. And in verse 9 comes what I believe really bothered Joshua as a human being. He says, "Now all the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land will hear about our defeat, so they'll come and surround us and cut off our name from the earth." The NET says, "will destroy the very memory of us from the earth." That was his real concern, and perhaps as a leader that had to carry on the legacy of Moses, that would make a lot of sense. But what does he do with that but turn it back to God as God's problem? He has the courage to do that, and he has the courage to ask God, "And what are you going to do about it? About keeping your name alive, or about protecting your great reputation?" Wow, there is a time for us to be concerned about us and what others will think or do when they find out certain things about us. But that time should be minimal. We need to quickly move on to what our real priority should be, and that is how this impacts God's name, not ours. People may want to erase Israel from the face of the earth. They may want to erase us from the face of the earth. But how does the fact that they want to do that impact God's plan, God's purpose, and our involvement in it? Robert Jameson suggests that Joshua asked this because he was convinced that his God, the God he knew, would never bring them this far and then all be lost. And he may well have been right. David Guzik argues that this shows Joshua's concern was indeed for the glory of God, as ours should be in our failures. What then are our lessons for us today from these 4 verses? First, we see that God isn't concerned about numbers. Sin in a camp, or a family, or a church is sin, no matter how few are involved. It has to be dealt with. Second, sincere sorrow, especially from the hearts of leaders, makes a difference for the people of God, as we will see later. Thirdly, as non-leaders, we're not excused, and we have a responsibility to ask ourselves, what did we do that may have indirectly contributed to the sin of others? Or conversely, what didn't I do, or what didn't I say that may have prevented this sin by others? Fourth, while we may feel like asking God some tough questions, as Joshua did, we're not to linger there for long. We know God has his reasons for doing things or allowing things. We need to live with it, accept it, and move on. Fifth, and finally, when we stumble due to disobedience or sin, our number one concern should be how it may impact the great name of God. And then to ask God, what can we do to minimize the negative impact? I believe many Christian leaders that have failed have way too often neglected that responsibility, desperately trying to save their own necks before men. There's always so much to learn from this action-packed book of Joshua. Next time, we look at how God reacts to Joshua's prayer in this time of trouble. Join us, share the video with others, study it with others, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss a single episode. In the meantime, take more time to get into the Word of God, even briefly, on your own.